Umibozu story by Silentkiller648 of the Horror Writer Amino. The open ocean, the salt in the air, the warmth of the sun on your skin and the calmness of the waves rocking back and forth, shaking the ship like a cradle. All that may seem true at first, causing many people to go out on boat trips and cruises occasionally. But when you're working on a boat and forced to go out into the middle of the sea every week, it's an entirely different story. You get storms and other fishermen always stopping you from doing your work, not to mention the constant threat of pirates attacking you every time you go past the sea border. Only happened to us once, but we always keep a spare assault rifle on board now every time we set sail. I sat in a hard plastic chair facing away from the sun, wearing sunglasses and a small baseball cap that said "Fun in the Sun" in cursive. We only set sail a couple of hours ago, but our captain, Bailey, knew all the tips and tricks of moving a fishing boat faster than anyone I knew. It was a blessing and a curse, because that meant that it took less time for us to do our job and get home, but we also got less time to relax on our way there. I usually spent my free time trying to get some extra sleep before all the back-breaking manual labour would kick in. Doesn't help much knowing that we have to set sail at 6 in the morning. "Ron, get over here and help me set up the nets," I groaned as I lazily turned my head towards my friend Kevin. He was always the most excited one to set sail for work, because his dad used to own a charter and fish with him as a kid. He tried to sound professional, but occasionally his kid-like personality would seep through. We could always rely on him to get the job done, no matter the task. That's why he was the boss. He motioned to me to get up as he pulled out even more giant, heavy bags that held more rope that we used to catch fish. We didn't care what fish we caught, just as long as it was edible and widely consumed. I slowly got up from the chair and stretched my back as I let out a long, exhausted yawn. I walked over to Kevin and quickly unfolded the nets one by one and put them on the large metal hooks that lined the side of the boat. They were rusty and seemed like they were going to break at any point, but what could you expect from a boat that was older than me? After around half an hour we were almost done, so I took a break for a second and grabbed a cold water bottle from the cooler sitting by my chair. "We're here!" shouted Bailey on the speakers. She turned off the engine and the entire boat was dead silent. She walked out of the steering room. We like to call it the wheelhouse out of pure irony because the entire room is smaller than my bed at home, but at the back of it was a small set of stairs that led down to our beds and storage. Kevin grabbed another net and put it on a hook at the front of the ship as Bailey walked over to me and put a hand on my shoulder. "How much sleep did you get last night?" I was a bit startled by the sudden onset of the question. It was Bailey. She always looked after both of us, acting like a mother figure trying to keep both Kevin and I from falling off the boat. I responded with a nonchalant, "Not much." Her face looked worried as she patted my shoulder lightly, trying to comfort me. "You should really try and find a therapist, Ron. You have to stop these nightmares." I had no idea why she was asking such a personal question, but I just nodded my head and walked away to help Kevin with the final net. I'd been having nightmares for the past couple of months. It only happened the night before we were supposed to set sail, causing me to lose sleep. It was always about all three on our little fishing charter in a storm during the middle of the night. Kevin was screaming for help as he was trying his hardest to find the assault rifle that was bumped around from all the tall waves crashing into us, as Bailey was trying to steer the ship out of the storm, using all the equipment in her wheelhouse to make as much noise as possible, trying to signal for help. Then I was just stood at the front of the ship, staring out into the sea as a giant creature loomed out of the ocean, seemingly covered in shadows, but was soon revealed to be just as dark as the night. As it stood before us, I noticed a flare sliding past my feet. I quickly grabbed it and pointed it at the creature, knowing that the flare would do nothing. Then I realized that there's no way out of the situation, so I point the flare towards me, close my eyes as the creature emits a low growl, and pull the trigger. I didn't know the reasoning behind the dream or why it pestered me in the first place. All I knew is that Bailey was worried for me and Kevin didn't even know about them. He was too focused on work to notice the bags under my eyes or even my sudden irritability to work after he woke me up. I didn't care if he noticed or not. All I cared about was that Bailey wasn't going through the same thing as me. Kevin walked over to the side of the wheel room and pulled a yellow lever that was labelled with a rusty yellow sign with words in big, black text saying, "Drop the nets." Immediately, all the nets that we put up fell into the water slowly and carefully, sinking faster and faster as the water soaked into the twine. Kevin kept his eyes at a small light next to the lever, staring at it intently with his hand motionless. The light turned on and immediately Kevin flipped the lever back up and the net stopped dropping into the water, just out of sight in the dark, murky waves, looking like giant jellyfish floating in the water. I walked past Bailey, trying to ignore the look of concern for me in her eyes every time she looked at me. Kevin sat down in my chair, putting his hands behind his head and said, "Now it's my turn to act lazy today." He finished the sentence with a happy sigh. I walked past him, noticing that he was staring at me. "About time you did some work today," he said with a lazy tone in his voice. I walked towards the wheelhouse and said, yeah, and went downstairs to my bed. I lay down in my hard, lumpy bed and stared at the pale yellow walls, hoping desperately that they would get any less boring, but sadly my wish didn't come true. I closed my eyes and thought about what I was going to do as soon as I got home. I was going to take a bath, watch TV, and most importantly of all, get some sleep in my new mattress. I sat back up and opened my eyes. Can't fall asleep yet. I wiped my eyes and stood up, turning around to see Kevin and Bailey's beds. We sleep in the same room to save space and money, but I'm surprised Kevin didn't buy us bunk beds. Then every time I went on this boat it would be like a sleepover. I heard Bailey yelling at me from the wheelhouse saying, "Ron, get up here, we need to talk to you." My first thought was that Bailey told Kevin about my sleeping problem, so I ran out of the room and halfway up the stairs before tripping in my half-asleep state. I hit the rifle that was perched just inside the stairs on the left wall, causing it to fall to the floor and slide into another room. I ignored it, figuring I was going to grab it after, so I ran back up the stairs and got into earshot of the conversation. "This storm's going to be really bad," said Bailey, holding out her phone to Kevin to show him something as he whispered, "Shit!" I walked over to them and interrupted. "What's this talk about a storm?" I tried to sound calm, but a hint of concern and fear managed to escape through my lips. Bailey held up her phone to me, revealing a weather map covered in red splotches over the screen. A storm was heading our way, and it was bad. "I thought you checked the weather this morning before we left!" I was angry, but I didn't mean to scream. I closed my mouth and walked over to the side of the boat to calm down. Bailey put down her phone and quickly responded, "I did, but with summer around the corner, weather is going to be unpredictable." She looked at me with a puzzled look and said, "You know that." I started to breathe faster. First my dreams about this boat and now a storm. Anger started to rise, only fueled by fear. I stared down at the waves below me, trying to focus on the soothing, gentle rocking of the boat. I felt like I was going to throw up. "Do you think if we leave fast enough we'll have time to outrun the storm?" asked Kevin. I looked behind me to see Bailey shaking her head and then back at the waves feeling sicker than ever. "Oh, I see." Kevin was silent for a second before saying, "Ron, we have to get ready for the storm. Grab any important supplies you can and put them in the storage room. We'll bring up the nets and put them back inside. Tomorrow we'll go home." The words sunk in my head and I couldn't believe it. I got nauseous as fragments of my dream popped into my head. That's when I threw up. A couple of hours later we were done with all the work and we were all in our beds, not lying down to sleep but sitting up to worry. I looked at Bailey and asked, "When will the storm start?" As if on cue, a deafening loud crack of thunder shook the boat, causing me to fall out of my bed and hit the floor. Kevin looked at me and smiled. "And there goes the onboard entertainment." I gave him a dirty look but decided not to fight him over it. Another crack of thunder shook the boat and the cocky look on Kevin's face turned to concern. "Do you guys think this boat will survive the storm?" Bailey looked around the room, then to Kevin and said, "This ship may be old, but it survived worse." Kevin looked around the room, then at me. I was a nervous wreck, sitting on my bed rocking back and forth, jumping at every boom of thunder. "Okay, we need to pack up supplies just in case." He stood up and started to pile up his prized possessions and necessities. Kevin always knew how to stay calm in these situations, unlike Bailey who started to grab anything in reach and throw it into her backpack. I was just sitting there thinking it was only one night and started to stand up. That's when I heard a loud groan come from the side of the ship. All of us looked at each other knowing that it wasn't a sound we were supposed to be hearing. I thought that the boat was already breaking up. I dropped my items and started to run up the stairs to see where the groan had come from. The entire boat leaned forwards, causing random items to fly everywhere. I fell on the stairs face first as Bailey, who was following me, held onto the walls. I got up dazed and continued to run up the stairs into the wheelhouse. That was the second time I'd hit my face on the stairs that day, but I didn't care anymore. I looked outside the front window and saw nothing but pitch blackness with rain flying sideways. A piece of hail fell on the glass and cracked it at the bottom, causing a small leak of cold rainwater to seep through the glass. I ran outside and looked all around the ship as I saw another wave coming towards the boat. I hugged the rail on the side of the boat as it lurched forwards, causing it to rise 10 feet into the air. My clothes were soaking wet and I was cold, but I had to find where the boat was damaged. I carefully started to walk along the sides, going against the wind causing my skin to tingle. I looked over the side every couple of minutes to see no damage. I looked back to notice Bailey was still inside the wheelhouse pressing buttons frantically. Another wave came towards the boat as I held onto the rail with all my strength. I closed my eyes thinking that this was how I was going to die. The boat started to rise quickly as I felt water running down my cheeks, but I couldn't tell if I was crying or it was the rain. The boat rose to an almost vertical position and I held onto the rail for my life. I felt my fingers starting to slip as the boat hung vertically for a second, I looked back at Bailey in the wheelhouse, seeing her trying to mess with buttons still, even though she was lying on the glass in an uncomfortable position. Suddenly, giant beams of light flooded the boat as it started to tilt back down. I relaxed as I felt my feet touch the floor again, and I slowly made my way to the front of the boat. I looked at the wheelhouse, seeing Kevin running out the door as all the supplies from the storage room flew everywhere in the harsh winds. I started to make my way to the back of the boat when I saw a black mass in the distance. It seemed eerily calm in the storm, so I thought it was land. "Bailey, we have land over there!" I shouted with all my might, but it still seemed pointless with all the wind muffling me. I looked back at the black landmass with hope in my eyes that I could finally get off this boat. But then I saw it move. It raised what looked like an arm into the air and hit the water, causing a splash so big it hit our boat. I walked back to the front of the boat as I heard a loud groan coming from that black figure. I looked at it as it sank back into the water. Bailey and Kevin saw it too, as I saw Kevin now frantically looking for something on the floor. I continued walking to the front of the boat as Bailey started to scream into intercoms for help as she wailed sirens in her horn. Deja vu was flooding back to me now as I continued to walk to the front of the boat slowly and carefully. I realised that Kevin must have been looking for the assault rifle to shoot whatever we'd seen out there. I knew what was going to happen next. I put my hands on the front rail and looked out to sea, ignoring all the deafening sounds filling the air. When the giant creature rose out of the sea almost gracefully, I stared at it in awe. I accepted my wondrous fate that today I would die, but I didn't care anymore. I looked down at my feet to see the flare sliding towards me as I picked it up instantly and put it to my head, not even bothering to point it at the monster that stood before me. It was beautiful. I fell to my knees as tears rolled down my cheeks, mixing with the rainwater. It raised its arm holding a fist, then it held it there as if waiting for something. Without putting the gun down, I spoke to it. "Thank you." I heard a deafening groan as it started to move its fist towards the boat, about to smash it and cause it to sink once and for all. I pulled the trigger right before the creature hit me. That was Umibozu's story, and I apologise if I've already mispronounced that. This one definitely had its share of faults, but I still loved it. I've mentioned before about my fear of the ocean, similar bodies of water, and this one just played perfectly to those fears. The thought of monstrous creatures lurking just below the waves, just out of sight, always sends shivers down my spine. It was nicely descriptive from the off, going into details about ambient environment, and that helps to draw the reader in and keep them hooked. Unfortunately, the tense swaps that occur all too often do undo quite a bit of that. In many stories, a dream sequence can be written in present tense, but in this particular one, the whole thing, including the dreams, should really have been past tense, and it did swap quite a few times between past and present. Punctuation seemed to be a bit of a running issue in this one as well. Full stops where there should be commas, commas where there should be full stops, punctuation where there shouldn't be any, and sometimes none where there should. For example, in the sentence, "When you're working on a boat and you're forced to go out in the middle of the sea every week, it's an entirely different story." The full stop should actually not be there, that should just be one sentence. And in the sentence, "His dad used to own a charter and fish with him as a kid," he tries to sound professional, but occasionally his kid-like personality will seep through, where he should be the start of the new sentence and there shouldn't be a comma after occasionally. Also, after speech in this, there's often no punctuation at all, blurring straight into the next sentence, and that makes it difficult to flow when reading. For example again, "Can't fall asleep yet? I wiped my eyes and looked up," where there should be a comma within the quotation marks at the end of the spoken part. This has an issue where it uses hyphens to join two words in a list, rather than make two separate words into a single word as they should be. So, for example, hard-lumpy and pale-yellow should be hard, lumpy and pale, yellow. Things like the line, "I walked past Bailey trying to ignore the look of concern for me in her eyes every time she looked at me," also harm the flow, as there should be a comma after Bailey to show that the protagonist is the one trying to avoid the look of concern rather than Bailey herself. I know it's obvious by the time you reach the end of the sentence, but it should be apparent as it goes along. There are a few typos that slip through the proofreading process, for example, causing me to fall off my bed and hit the floor. I started to breath faster, causing a splash too big it hit our boat, even though there was laying on the glass in an uncomfortable position, etc. I did try and pick up on these and correct them when I did the narration of the story, though. One of the largest issues with this story is the dialogue. A lot of the time in this, all the dialogue goes in the same block of text, whereas a new speaker should always get a new line. It makes it difficult to know who's talking a lot of the time, as actions of another character follow the first's dialogue. "Ron, get over here and help me set up the nets," I groaned as I lazily turned my head towards my friend Kevin. This implies that the protagonist, being Ron, was the one talking thanks to the "I groaned lazily" part, but it can't be, otherwise he'd be talking to himself. The end of the sentence referring to Kevin implies that it's him, though it still doesn't make that conclusive. This happens quite a few times in the story, and trying to figure out who's talking draws the reader out rather than pulling them in. As I mentioned when talking about punctuation, it's very often missing after dialogue whether or not the sentence continues, and when there is, it's often wrong, as in, "The storm is going to be really bad," said Bailey, holding out her phone. The full stop in that sentence should be a comma, as though the sentence within the dialogue is finished, the sentence itself has not. There are a few instances of redundancy or repetition that detract from the story a little bit as well, though this may affect it more as a narration than as a read story. The light turned on and immediately Kevin flipped the lever back up and the net stopped dropping into the water. Just out of sight in the dark murky waves, looking like giant jellyfish floating in the water. Into the water and in the water are redundancies to each other here and make it sound clunky when read. This is easily fixed by saying, "looking like giant jellyfish just below the surface." Many or even most of the faults this story does have, though, are more than made up for by the imagery and description in the thrilling and action segments. You can picture the sideways blowing rain spattering the windshield. You can imagine feeling it tingling your face as you step outside into the maelstrom. Your gut almost lurches with the protagonist as that boat tilts vertically, and you can imagine them just clinging to the railing for dear life. And then there's that gnawing, drilling sense of deja vu as the nightmare just starts to become real around him, only to see that looming black mass in the distance, hoping desperately that it's actually land. That is one small change I did make, though. Initially, the story did call that giant mass a figure, though I did change it to a black mass. It kind of gives it a little bit of hope that things may still be different. A tiny little chance for survival, only to be dashed immediately. It just has a bit more of an impact than it would have done if it was immediately referred to as a figure, giving away that it was, in fact, just the nightmare coming true. The ultimate turn-off for this story, though, the killer of any suspension of disbelief, is the first-person perspective. This in and of itself is not the issue. Many great stories have been written in first person, but when the protagonist dies at the end of such a story, it just feels like a giant middle finger to the reader, because there's no way they could be telling their story if they themselves had died. The only way to really get away with it is for it to be in the story of someone who's about to die, whether this is in the style of Lovecraft, where it's in the diary of someone who just managed to finish it before their demise, though this is starting to become a tired old cliché now, or, spoiler alert, in James Herbert's Others, where the main character is recounting their story after discovering that they're dying. A first-person story where the protagonist recounts the details of their death is almost impossible to get right, and even then pretty much only by going into third person to show someone hovering over a Ouija board or something. There are very few stories without potential, and this one does have a very good amount. Yes, it has its issues, but it's currently not bad, and with some work it could become something excellent. If you like the video, hit that like button, feel free to comment with your opinions on the video and the story, and subscribe for more. Until next time, everybody be beautiful to each other.